The Galactic Council had always seemed like an untouchable force, distant and almost mythical to those on Earth. For decades, they had monitored humanity from afar, occasionally sending messages filled with thinly veiled warnings about the dangers of human expansion. For most of history, humans had ignored these communications as strange, bureaucratic noise from beings whose power and motives seemed beyond comprehension. But over time, the warnings became sharper, more pointed. They spoke of humanities, colonies in the stars, of technologies humans had developed faster than the Council anticipated, and of the independence that humans stubbornly clung to, even when others around them bowed to interstellar authorities. Not at first, humans had responded politely. Delegations traveled across light years to the Council's crystalline orbiting chambers, where they were met with beings of impossible shapes and colors, whose voices carried a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through human bones. These diplomats, careful and deliberate, spoke of peace, cooperation, and shared knowledge. They explained humanity's expansion, not as aggression, but as survival and exploration. For a time, it seemed that reason had a place in the galaxy, and humans left with promises that the Council would consider their position. But the promises rarely translated into action. Instead, humanity found itself increasingly restricted. The Council issued regulations on everything from the size of colonies to the development of certain technologies. Their agents monitored every outpost, demanding reports and inspections that bordered on intrusive. Human engineers, who had dreamed of reaching distant worlds freely, now found themselves filling endless forms and attending meetings with beings who seemed incapable of understanding anything outside their rigid codes. Despite the growing frustration most humans endured, they reminded themselves that they were small in a galaxy vast beyond imagination. The Council had fleets far larger and more advanced than anything Earth could muster. For decades, patience and diplomacy had been humanity's shields, and they had survived this way, quietly bending where bending was necessary. But patience, even in humans, has its limits, and that limit was approaching faster than anyone could have anticipated. The breaking point began on a distant colony at the edge of known human space. It was a small outpost, nothing more than a scientific research hub, but it had been making remarkable discoveries in quantum energy. These discoveries had the potential to change everything from travel speeds between stars to clean energy for countless planets. The Council took notice, but not with curiosity. Instead, they acted with suspicion, labeling the researchers as dangerous and unpredictable. One morning, the colony's communications tower transmitted a message that would soon ripple across the galaxy. The message was interrupted, garbled, filled with static, but the fragments were clear enough. Ships had arrived suddenly, larger than any the colony had ever seen. Their arrival was not announced. It was violent, precise. The Council's fleet descended on the settlement, and those who lived there watched in disbelief as their laboratories were boarded, their data seized, and their colleagues detained. The humans on the colony sent out distress signals, hoping Earth could respond. But the Council interfered, blocking most of the messages and ensuring that what got through painted a very different picture, one that made it seem as if humans had been resisting and provoking the Council. The truth, however, was far more sinister. Civilians and scientists were being treated harshly, some even injured in ways that were never fully explained. For the first time, humans across Earth felt a pang of fear, not for themselves, but for their people, their friends, and the dream of exploration that was being attacked for no reason other than arrogance from the Council. When the footage finally leaked to Earth, there was silence for a moment. The grainy images of ships descending on the colony, of people being rounded up against their will, shocked millions. Humans who had spent decades believing that diplomacy could protect them now understood the harsh reality. The Council saw humanity not as an equal, but as a problem to be contained. Governments scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were held in cities that had never before known such urgency. Leaders spoke in calm tones, but their eyes betrayed their anger. News outlets ran continuous coverage, showing images of the raided colony, and public outrage surged. Social media exploded, with messages of solidarity, disbelief, and growing fury. It was the first time in human history that a unified anger seemed to stretch across the planet, bridging every cultural, political, and social divide. People began to realize that diplomacy had limits. Earth had always tried to appeal to reason, to show evidence of human achievements, and to demonstrate that their expansion was not a threat, but a natural evolution. The Council had ignored every attempt at peaceful resolution, every argument for understanding. The raid on the colony was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of condescension and control. Humanity had been pushed, prodded, and dismissed for too long. As the day wore on, the mood shifted from fear to determination. Citizens, once timid in the face of interstellar authority, now demanded action. Peaceful protests erupted outside government buildings, calling for humanity to take a stand. Scientists and engineers who had spent years developing advanced technologies offered their knowledge for defense. Military strategists worked in overdrive, reviewing what Earth had been quietly building for decades. In quiet corners of the world, ordinary people discussed what had once seemed impossible. Could humanity truly stand up to the Council? Could they resist beings who had ruled the stars for generations? Yet, beneath the doubt, there was a growing sense of pride. For the first time, humans felt that their ingenuity, their resilience, and their unity might actually matter on a cosmic scale. By nightfall, Earth's leaders convened in a secure, undisclosed location. They spoke of options that once would have been unthinkable, recalling all diplomats, halting interstellar trade, and mobilizing the fleets that had long been kept in reserve. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would no longer allow itself to be manipulated or humiliated. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of centuries. Enough. It was more than a declaration. It was a promise, not just to those on the raided colony, but to every human who had worked, dreamed, and fought for centuries to make life among the stars possible. Humanity had tolerated the Council's arrogance, their overreach, and their threats. But now they would act. The Council had crossed a line, and humans had finally snapped. Across Earth, a strange sense of clarity settled over people. For decades, they had lived in the shadow of beings who saw themselves as superior, who treated human achievements as minor annoyances. Now there was no more shadow. Humanity's response would not be impulsive or reckless. It would be calculated, coordinated, and undeniable. Every scientist, soldier, and citizen understood that the galaxy had underestimated them for the last time. Even those who had doubted humanity's readiness for such a confrontation began to feel hope. There was power in unity, in the shared recognition that the species they called home would no longer kneel to intimidation. Across conference halls, command centers, and homes, people prepared for what they knew could be the most pivotal chapter in human history. The anger, the fear, and the outrage had transformed into resolve. Humanity was awake, and the galaxy would soon understand the consequences of ignoring them. And so, the first chapter of a new era began not with violence, but with a quiet, unwavering determination. The Council's arrogance had awakened a force it could not contain, a force that had learned patience, but now understood that some boundaries, once crossed, demand response. Humanity had finally snapped, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The aftermath of the raid on the remote human colony spread across Earth like a wildfire. The footage, grainy yet unmistakable, showed what no human had ever expected to witness. A peaceful scientific outpost reduced to chaos. Its people heard it. By beings from the Galactic Council, with no regard for human life or dignity. Across the planet, millions watched in stunned silence. And then, slowly, anger began to rise. Not the quiet, simmering anger of everyday frustrations, but a deep, raw, and unified fury that cut across politics, cultures, and continents. People remembered the countless times the Council had spoken down to humanity, dismissed their ideas, and imposed rules that seemed designed only to control rather than guide. They remembered the restrictions on interstellar travel, the endless inspections, and the ever-growing bureaucracy that monitored human colonies as if they were children who could not be trusted. And now, when a peaceful outpost was attacked and innocent lives were disrupted, that long-suppressed anger ignited fully. Governments moved quickly. Emergency sessions were called in global assemblies, and debates raged late into the night. Military leaders and scientists worked side by side, reviewing every piece of intelligence, every report, and every technological development that could give humanity a fighting chance. Unlike the Council, Earth had spent decades quietly preparing, slowly building a network of fleets, defenses, and strategies that had gone largely unnoticed by the rest of the galaxy. Now, these resources were being examined with urgency, and plans began to take shape. But it wasn't just the governments and military that reacted. Ordinary people on Earth, the ones who had never looked beyond their skies, were now talking about stars as if they were home. News feeds were flooded with messages of solidarity for the raided colony. Scientists discussed possible solutions to protect other colonies. Engineers proposed improvements to fleet designs. And even artists and writers shared visions of resistance, hope, and unity. The human spirit, once confined to the surface of a single planet, was reaching out into the galaxy with a determination that had defined the species for centuries. The first challenge was understanding exactly what had happened at the colony. Communications had been largely cut, and what information remained was chaotic. But a small team of engineers, diplomats, and analysts worked tirelessly, piecing together intercepted signals and scattered reports. Slowly, a picture emerged. Council's fleet had arrived without warning, boarding ships descending on the settlement in precision maneuvers. Laboratories were searched, equipment was confiscated, and researchers were taken against their will. Despite the Council's claims that it had been a routine security operation, the evidence suggested otherwise. The raid was targeted, deliberate, and punitive. As the details became clear, the human population reacted in waves. Outrage led to protests, not violent, but impossible to ignore. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, holding banners that demanded justice, accountability, and a firm response. Social media erupted with live footage, analysis, and debates that stretched across continents. Ordinary citizens, from children to the elderly, spoke of pride in humanity, but also a clear understanding that it was time to act. For the first time, it felt like the entire planet was united by a single cause, a cause greater than politics, borders, or personal ambition. Meanwhile, scientists and engineers across Earth began sharing knowledge at unprecedented speeds. Secret projects, once limited to specialized teams, were now being discussed openly within trusted networks. Ideas for advanced defensive systems, fleet coordination, and protective technologies flowed freely. There was no time for jealousy, no room for rivalry. The message was simple: protect humanity, protect the colonies, and make sure the Council could never do this again. Amid the chaos, a different kind of preparation began. Strategic simulations were run, predicting the Council's potential moves, their tactics, and possible weaknesses. Humans had long been underestimated, and now that underestimation became an advantage. Analysts predicted that the Council would expect fear, hesitation, and negotiation. They would not anticipate the level of coordination and resilience humans could bring to bear. For decades, Earth had quietly honed its capabilities, and now necessity demanded that those capabilities be fully realized. As the world watched the events unfold, the Council remained oblivious to the human response. Their representatives continued to issue statements attempting to justify their actions, claiming that the colony had violated interstellar regulations. But these statements only fueled more outrage on Earth. It was clear to every human that the Council did not understand what they had done. They had not just attacked a colony. They had attacked the pride, patience, and dignity of an entire species. The sense of injustice was palpable. Families of scientists and engineers at the colony shared their stories with the media, describing the confusion, fear, and heartbreak of those who had been taken or displaced. Every report brought more clarity to what had really happened, and more fuel to the fire of human determination. Across the planet, people no longer whispered about resistance, they demanded it. They demanded action not for revenge, but to protect themselves and ensure that no other human colony would ever suffer the same fate. As preparations continued, communication networks were secured and enhanced. The world had learned the painful lesson. Information could no longer be left vulnerable. Messages were encrypted, fleets were coordinated through private channels, and the sharing of critical knowledge became a top priority. This was not simply a defensive effort, it was the first step in a global awakening, where humanity began to recognize its own potential as a unified species in the galaxy. Amid this, ordinary acts of heroism began to appear. Scientists working long hours on energy shields, engineers developing defensive drones, and pilots volunteering for dangerous training exercises all contributed to a collective effort that transcended individual ambition. The people of Earth, once seen as passive or subordinate by the Council, were now demonstrating a quiet but undeniable force. The lesson was clear. Underestimation would be humanity's greatest advantage. Even in the midst of fear and anger, hope flourished. For every story of loss, there were stories of ingenuity and courage. Communities rallied to support the families affected by the colony's raid, sharing resources, knowledge, and comfort. People on Earth began to understand that this was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight to prove that humanity deserved a voice among the stars. The attack on one colony had inadvertently united billions, igniting a spark that had long been dormant. The leaders of Earth convened again, this time with a clear understanding of what had to be done. The decision was no longer about negotiation or diplomacy. It was about readiness, unity, and demonstrating to the Council that humanity could not be controlled through intimidation. Plans were drafted for fleet mobilization, communication security, and protective measures for other colonies. Experts worked together to ensure that every possible angle was considered, every potential weakness addressed. It was meticulous work, fueled by anger, but guided by strategic thinking. As days turned into nights, the human population waited, watched, and prepared. There was a shared understanding that the Council had crossed a line, and that line could never be ignored. The attack on the colony had been a turning point, a moment that forced humanity to confront a reality it had long resisted. The galaxy was not a place where patience alone would ensure survival. Action was necessary, and humanity was finally ready to take it. In quiet moments, people reflected on the enormity of what was unfolding. The stars, once distant and untouchable, now seemed closer, not in terms of distance, but in terms of possibility. The Council's arrogance had awakened a force that had been growing quietly on Earth for centuries, of force that combined intelligence, creativity, resilience, and unity. Humanity had snapped, but in that snapping was a focus, a determination, and an understanding that their species would no longer be underestimated. By the end of this chapter, the stage was set. Humanity was no longer passive. They had experienced the cruelty of the Council firsthand and understood the stakes. What began as outrage had transformed into preparation, hope, and an unshakable resolve. The raid on the colony was no longer just an event. It was the spark that ignited a movement, a global awakening that would soon make the galaxy take notice. The moment had arrived when humans realized that their patience had been tested for too long. The Council had crossed the line, and now humanity was ready to respond. The world was changing, quietly but irreversibly. Ordinary people, once confined by the limits of their planet, were now part of a larger story, a story that stretched across stars and light years. They were no longer simply observers, they were participants in shaping the destiny of humanity. And as night fell across the planet, a sense of calm determination settled in every city, every town, every home. The humans of Earth were awake, united, and ready. The raid on the colony had been cruel, but it had also been the catalyst for something far greater, a species finally realizing its true potential among the stars. Humanity's patience had run out. After the raid on the distant colony, there was no going back. For centuries, humans had tolerated the Council's condescending rules, its endless restrictions, and its unyielding control over human colonies. For decades, Earth had relied on diplomacy, trying to show reason, intelligence, and goodwill. But the attack proved that the Council did not see humans as equals. They saw them as children to control, as a species to contain. And after all this time, humans were finally done listening. On Earth, the mood was electric. In every city, town, and settlement, people felt it. There was fear, yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been replaced by something stronger: determination. Governments no longer debated whether to act. They debated how to act. Military leaders reviewed centuries of human innovation, technology, and fleet designs, remembering how each advancement had been dismissed by the Council as insignificant. Now, those very advancements would become the foundation of a new approach. The message was clear. Humanity would respond, but on its own terms, not in secure command centers around the planet. Humans worked day and night, coordinating logistics, communications, and defensive systems. Fleets that had been quietly stationed across the solar system were now mobilized. Ships that once had the appearance of research vessels were upgraded and armed, their technology enhanced in ways the Council had never anticipated. Engineers collaborated with military strategists, scientists with tacticians, combining decades of knowledge into a single purpose: to ensure that no human settlement would ever face the Council's wrath unprotected again. The announcement came quietly, but it carried weight beyond measure. Diplomats were recalled from Council space, trade routes were suspended, and all communications with Council-controlled sectors were severed. Earth did not send threats or ultimatums. There was only one word: enough. It was a word that encapsulated centuries of patience, endurance, and perseverance. Humans were not seeking revenge. They were asserting their place in the galaxy. They were demanding recognition. Ordinary people played a role as well. Across the planet, volunteers assisted with fleet preparation, communication encryption, and research efforts. Cities turned into centers of innovation, schools into training grounds, and workshops into production lines for protective technologies. The attack on the colony had awakened something that had lain dormant for generations: a belief in humanity's own power, in their ability to stand united when it mattered most. For the first time, there was a shared understanding. The Council had underestimated humanity, and that mistake would not be repeated. For decades, humans had allowed themselves to be controlled and measured by external standards. Now, they measured themselves by their own abilities, ingenuity, and courage. It was a profound shift in perspective, one that gave ordinary people a sense of ownership in the fight to protect their species. They were no longer subjects of an interstellar authority. They were citizens of a species, capable of defending itself. As fleets moved into position across the solar system, Earth's leaders coordinated with remote colonies, ensuring that every outpost had defenses, communication links, and contingency plans. Satellites and orbital stations were upgraded with advanced sensors and shields. Scientists worked on technologies that could detect Council movements in real time, while pilots trained relentlessly for rapid response scenarios. Humanity was preparing not for war, but for survival and for the assertion of their rightful place in the galaxy. The Council, however, remained unaware of the depth of human readiness. They believed that humanity's anger would be limited to rhetoric, that Earth would negotiate, or that they would retreat under the weight of intimidation. They assumed that human patience had limits, and that once tested, humanity would revert to submission. What they did not understand was that human patience was no longer relevant. Humanity had snapped, and they were now acting with focus, discipline, and unity. Even in the midst of preparation, humans did not lose sight of their purpose. The goal was not destruction or conquest. Every decision, every calculation, and every movement of the fleets was designed to protect lives, maintain freedom, and ensure that no species, including humans, would ever be treated as less than equals. The energy that had once been anger was now being channeled into precision, strategy, and foresight. Humanity's response would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate, calculated, and undeniable. Stories of heroism began to spread. Scientists, who had spent decades in isolation on distant colonies, volunteered to share knowledge that could strengthen Earth's defenses. Engineers worked in continuous shifts, designing systems that could anticipate and counter Council strategies. Ordinary citizens trained in emergency response, learning to assist in operations that had once seemed impossible. Even families affected by the colony raid contributed, sharing intelligence, coordinating communications, and offering support wherever it was needed. Humanity was uniting on a scale never seen before, across every border and every sector. As the days passed, Earth's leadership continued to strengthen the planet's position. Communication hubs were made secure, fleets were strategically positioned, and colonies were placed under protection. At the same time, human diplomats prepared evidence of the Council's transgressions, documenting the raid and the abuse of power in a manner that could not be ignored by the galaxy. This was a crucial step. Humanity was not acting blindly. They were acting with authority, intelligence, and undeniable proof of wrongdoing. For ordinary humans, the transformation was remarkable. People who had once felt powerless now experienced a sense of purpose and agency. Communities rallied around shared goals. Scientists collaborated across continents, and military personnel trained with renewed focus. The raid on the colony had been cruel, but it had also revealed the strength that had always existed within humanity. It was no longer a question of survival alone. It was a question of asserting the right to exist freely, without interference, without intimidation, and without fear. The mood across the planet was both tense and hopeful. Citizens understood the stakes, but they also understood their own power. Humanity had endured famine, disease, wars, and countless challenges throughout history, and now they were facing a new threat, a cosmic one, but they were ready. The anger that had initially surged after the colony raid had been tempered by strategic thinking, and now it had become a force for focus, coordination, and resolve. Every human knew the truth. The Council had crossed the line. They had acted with arrogance, believing that a peaceful, isolated species could be easily intimidated and controlled. But they had underestimated the combination of human creativity, resilience, and unity. The Council had no idea that humans had been quietly preparing, developing fleets, technologies, and strategies that now position them to act decisively. In command centers, strategy simulations projected every possible move the Council could take, every fleet they could send, and every tactic they might employ. Analysts worked tirelessly to anticipate weaknesses, while engineers developed solutions to counter them. Nothing was left to chance. The humans who had once been considered naive or impulsive were now methodical, deliberate, and patient in their preparation. Their patience had simply transformed into readiness, and all the while, the ordinary people of Earth continued to contribute. Volunteers monitored communications, ensured supplies for fleets and colonies, and coordinated logistics. Schools and universities became hubs of innovation, turning classrooms into laboratories for problem-solving and technological advancement. The attack on the colony had inadvertently inspired a global effort that no one could have imagined just weeks before. By the end of this period, humanity had reached a state of readiness unlike any before. Fleets were in position, colonies were protected, and communication networks were secure. Evidence of the Council's abuses had been compiled and verified. Earth had made a choice, and that choice was clear. Humanity would no longer tolerate intimidation or aggression. They were prepared to defend themselves, their colonies, and their freedom with every resource, skill, and talent available. As night fell across Earth, there was a sense of calm determination. The storm of anger had passed, replaced by focus and purpose. Humanity understood that the moment had come to act, not with haste or recklessness, but with intelligence, coordination, and resolve. The Council had assumed that humans would retreat, negotiate, or falter. They had been wrong. Humanity had snapped, but in that snapping was precision, planning, and unyielding strength. The world slept knowing that history was being made. Every scientist, soldier, and citizen had played a role in preparing for what was to come. The attack on the colony, once a moment of fear and despair, had become the catalyst for unity, innovation, and resilience on a planetary scale. Humans were no longer passive participants in galactic politics. They were a force that demanded recognition, respect, and equality. And so, as the stars shone above, Earth prepared to make its next move. The Council had crossed the line, and humanity had finally snapped. But this snapping was not chaos. It was purpose. It was readiness. It was the first step in proving to the galaxy that humans would no longer be underestimated, controlled, or dismissed. Humanity's response would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate. The Council believed they had humanity cornered. They thought the raids, the intimidation, and the years of control had proven that humans would ultimately bow to authority. They assumed fear would prevail, that the species would kneel when faced with the weight of interstellar power. But they had been wrong. Humanity was no longer the same. The attack on the distant colony had awakened something the Council could never have imagined. A species united, determined, and ready to act with precision. As Earth's fleets moved silently into position, the Council attempted to make the first move. Their ships, sleek and immense, glided toward human territory, prepared to enforce regulations and punish defiance. They believed in their superiority, in their ability to strike quickly and decisively. What they did not realize was that the humans had anticipated this. Every maneuver, every potential strike had been calculated, analyzed, and countered before it even happened. The first encounter happened near the edge of the solar system, in a region long considered neutral and empty. The Council fleet appeared, confident and formidable, expecting human hesitation. But the humans did not hesitate. Without firing a shot, human ships moved into strategic positions, cutting off escape routes and surrounding the Council forces with an efficiency that shocked observers. The Council had faced many species across countless worlds, but never one so precise, so coordinated and so united. For the humans, this was not a battle for revenge. It was a demonstration of strength, a statement that they would no longer be underestimated. They disabled the Council ship's engines and communication, systems using techniques that relied on precision rather than destruction. The human fleet moved as one, each ship aware of the others, executing maneuvers that seemed to anticipate every possible move the Council could make. From the command centers on Earth, leaders watched the engagement unfold with a mixture of pride and quiet intensity. This was the moment all the preparation, planning, and coordination had led to. Humans had not rushed blindly into conflict. Every action was deliberate, every decision calculated. The Council had expected chaos, fear, and submission. Instead, they encountered calm, intelligence, and unity, the defining traits of humanity at its best. Back on Earth, the population followed the events in real time through secure transmissions. Ordinary citizens, who had only weeks before been filled with fear and uncertainty, now witnessed the full scope of humanity's capabilities. Engineers, scientists, and military personnel, all of whom had contributed to the preparation, felt a surge of pride. For decades, the Council had dismissed human progress, underestimated their ingenuity, and ignored their potential. Now, humans were proving that potential without question. The disabled Council ships drifted silently, powerless but intact. Humans did not destroy them. There was no need. The objective was clear: show strength without unnecessary violence, protect lives, and make the point unmistakable. Humanity's actions sent a message not only to the Council, but to every species watching across the galaxy. Humans were awake, united, and unwilling to be intimidated. The Council's reaction was immediate confusion and disbelief. Their assumptions had failed, their tactics had been anticipated, and their forces were immobilized by a species they had long regarded as insignificant. Council officials argued among themselves, attempting to understand how humans had achieved such precise coordination. Their surprise quickly turned into alarm as additional human fleets arrived to reinforce the initial group, demonstrating that what had been seen was only a fraction of humanity's capabilities. For humanity, the moment was a turning point. It was proof that preparation, intelligence, and unity could overcome fear and intimidation. Human pilots, engineers, and tacticians all understood that this encounter was not the end of the challenge. It was the first demonstration of what could be accomplished when the species acted together. But even as they celebrated the success, there was no arrogance. Humans knew the galaxy was vast, and the Council had resources far beyond Earth's immediate reach. The victory was a statement, not a declaration of finality. Ordinary people continued to play a role. Across the planet, communities monitored communications, analyzed data, and contributed to ongoing preparations. Volunteers worked around the clock to ensure that fleets remained supplied and colonies were protected. Children who had once only dreamed of the stars now followed the progress of human forces with fascination and hope. This was a collective awakening, a moment in history that united not just governments and militaries, but entire societies. The disabled Council ships became a symbol of human ingenuity. Scientists and engineers studied them, understanding weaknesses and strengths, learning how the Council had approached the engagement, and planning for the future. This knowledge, combined with Earth's existing advancements, gave humans a strategic advantage that would shape every interaction going forward. The lesson was clear. The Council could no longer assume dominance. Humanity had proven that it could act decisively, strategically, and without hesitation. The broader galaxy began to take notice. Observers from neutral systems watched the encounter, recording every detail. For centuries, humans had been underestimated, dismissed as unpredictable or unworthy of serious attention. Now they were being studied, analyzed, and respected. The Council's miscalculation had shifted the balance of perception. Humans were no longer the species to be controlled. They were a force to be reckoned with. Despite the success, Earth's leaders maintained focus. They understood that the Council would regroup, that this encounter was only a prelude to further challenges. Preparations continued at an accelerated pace. Additional fleets were deployed to strategic positions, colonies were reinforced, and communication networks were strengthened. Every human contribution, from scientists to volunteers, played a role in building resilience and ensuring readiness for whatever came next. For ordinary citizens, the encounter sparked a new sense of purpose. Communities rallied around shared goals, contributing time, skills, and resources. People who had once felt powerless now understood that they were part of something far greater than themselves. The defense of their species was no longer the responsibility of a few. It was the responsibility of all. The raid on the distant colony had ignited a movement that stretched across every continent, every sector, and every settlement. Even in the midst of tension, there was pride. Humanity had faced countless challenges on Earth and had emerged stronger each time. Now, those same traits, ingenuity, resilience, and determination, were being applied on a galactic scale. The first encounter with the Council fleet demonstrated that humans could act decisively, protect their own, and send a message without unnecessary violence. It was a lesson in strength, unity, and foresight. The disabled Council ships also served as a warning. Humanity was not reckless. They did not seek unnecessary destruction, but they were fully capable of defending themselves and their colonies. This distinction was crucial. The humans' response was calculated, precise, and undeniably powerful. It showed that strength could coexist with restraint, and that intelligence and unity could achieve what sheer force alone could not. As the situation unfolded, analysts on Earth studied every detail, refining strategies and preparing for the Council's next move. Fleets were adjusted, colonies were reinforced, and communication systems were hardened. Every citizen, from scientists to volunteers, understood that this was only the beginning. The Council had been surprised once, but humanity would not allow them to catch them off guard again. Preparation, coordination, and unity were now the defining principles guiding human actions. By the end of this engagement, the human population had experienced a profound transformation. The anger that had sparked after the colony raid had evolved into a combination of pride, determination, and strategic thinking. Ordinary people understood that they were part of a larger story, one that stretched across the stars and demanded courage, intelligence, and unity. Humanity had proven that it could act decisively, protect its own, and assert its presence in the galaxy. That the first strike had shocked the Council, but for humans, it was a lesson in possibility. They had learned that patience had limits, that preparation could overcome fear, and that unity could surpass intimidation. The success of this engagement was not the end. It was a reminder of what humans were capable of when they acted together. The species had finally taken its place among the stars, not as a passive participant, but as a force that demanded recognition and respect. As night fell on Earth, a sense of calm focus settled across the planet. Humans knew that the Council would attempt to recover, that future challenges would arise, and that the galaxy was vast and unpredictable. But for the first time, humans were ready. They were not acting out of fear or desperation. They were acting with clarity, purpose, and unity. The first strike had demonstrated what could be achieved through preparation, coordination, and unwavering resolve. The Council had crossed the line, and humanity had snapped, but this snapping was not chaos. It was control, precision, and a demonstration of intelligence and strength. Humanity had shown that it could protect its people, assert its presence, and command attention across the galaxy. The first strike was only the beginning, a statement that would echo through every cyst. The first strike had shocked the Council. Ships that were meant to intimidate humans were now powerless, disabled without a single human casualty. Across the galaxy, observers began to whisper about the species they had long underestimated. But, for humanity, the engagement was only the beginning. There was no celebration, no sense of final victory. Every scientist, soldier, and citizen understood that the Council would respond, and that response could be even more aggressive. Preparation, planning, and vigilance became the focus. Human analysts immediately began reviewing every movement of the Council fleet. They studied patterns, calculated potential strategies, and predicted possible counterattacks. Engineers worked tirelessly to enhance ship defenses, improve communication security, and develop adaptive technologies that could respond in real time. Every day, more data arrived from colonies, satellites, and sensors placed across human-controlled space. All of it was integrated into a single, coordinated system. Humanity had learned that to survive and to protect its people, it could not rely on luck. It could only rely on intelligence, strategy, and unity. The Council scrambled. Their officials argued in corridors that stretched across light years, their voices echoing in chambers of crystal and steel. They were confused, alarmed, and frustrated. Their decades of authority over human colonies were collapsing in real time, and they could not comprehend how a species they had long considered subordinate could act with such precision. Every attempt to communicate with Earth was blocked or intercepted. Diplomacy had failed, and the Council began to understand that their previous assumptions about humanity had been dangerously wrong. On Earth, the response was not guided by pride or arrogance, but by clarity. Humanity did not seek unnecessary confrontation. Their goal was protection, justice, and ensuring that no colony would ever face the Council's arbitrary wrath again. Communication networks were secured and fortified. Satellites were upgraded to detect any movement across vast stretches of space. Colonies were reinforced with defenses that were previously only theoretical. Human fleets were positioned strategically, ready to respond instantly to any threat. Every citizen contributed, in one way or another, to this immense preparation. First human action that followed the initial strike was carefully calculated. Cyber units, composed of the brightest minds in artificial intelligence, coding, and strategy, moved to disable the Council's communication hubs in sectors near human colonies. Without destroying the infrastructure, they ensured that the Council could not coordinate easily or manipulate information. What had once been the Council's greatest advantage, the ability to strike and control, was now a vulnerability. Humanity used technology not for destruction, but for control over the situation, and the message was unmistakable. Humans would act decisively to protect themselves. Meanwhile, diplomats and leaders prepared evidence of the Council's abuses. Records of the colony raid, intercepted communications, and decades of bureaucratic oppression were compiled and verified. These reports were shared with other species across the galaxy. For centuries, humans had been dismissed and underestimated. Now, they were asserting authority not through violence alone, but through undeniable truth. Across countless systems, species began to realize that the Council was not always fair, that its actions could be questioned, and that humanity was no longer willing to remain silent. Ordinary humans on Earth were part of this effort as well. Volunteers monitored incoming communications, assisted in research and data compilation, and coordinated logistics for fleets and colonies. Communities rallied to support families affected by the colony raid, while students and scientists contributed ideas that could strengthen defense systems and improve strategy. The attack had united humanity in a way that no single government or authority could have predicted. Every citizen understood that their actions, no matter how small, could influence the outcome of a conflict that now stretched across light years. For the Council, the realization that they were no longer in control was both humbling and frightening. Their fleet had been disabled without loss of life, their communications disrupted, and their authority questioned. The entire galaxy began to take notice. Neutral species, once indifferent to human affairs, now observed the actions of Earth with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Humans were demonstrating that even a relatively young species could act with intelligence, coordination, and moral clarity. The Council's image of unquestionable authority was crumbling, and they struggled to respond. Back on Earth, preparation continued without pause. Fleets were moved to cover potential gaps in defense. Colonies were reinforced with advanced shields and sensor networks. Engineers developed new strategies to anticipate Council movements. Humans had learned from the first engagement that overconfidence could be dangerous, and they approached every action with precision and care. Even the smallest detail, from fuel reserves to data encryption, was scrutinized and secured. The human approach was not just technological. There was a psychological element as well. Citizens were encouraged to stay informed, involved, and engaged, fostering a collective awareness that no human would be left unprepared. Families communicated with colonies, volunteers assisted with training, and educators turned classrooms into workshops for problem-solving and critical thinking. The response was holistic, uniting every sector of human society in a single purpose: to protect humanity and assert their rightful place in the galaxy. When the first evidence of Council corruption and manipulation was made public, the reaction was immediate and profound. Across countless systems, species that had once trusted the Council began to question its actions. Some expressed support for humanity, while others quietly prepared to reconsider their alliances. The galaxy, which had long seen humans as impulsive and subordinate, now recognized a species capable of intelligence, strategy, and moral authority. Humanity was no longer simply reacting. They were leading a narrative, reshaping perceptions, and asserting truth. Even the volunteers who had never been to space played a role. Analysts working from Earth monitored fleets and predicted potential threats. Engineers on distant colonies shared technological improvements and defensive upgrades. Citizens contributed knowledge, labor, and support. Every human action, from the smallest to the most critical, contributed to a larger network of readiness and protection. The species had become a single, united force. The Council's next moves were careful, but limited. They could not risk further escalation, knowing their communications were compromised and their fleets had been tested and countered. Still, they attempted small maneuvers to probe human defenses, hoping to identify weaknesses. Every attempt failed. Humans anticipated each action, countered with precision, and gathered intelligence that strengthened their position further. Every failure of the Council reinforced the growing understanding that humanity's unity, preparation, and ingenuity were far greater than anticipated. On Earth, there was no celebration, only focus. The humans understood that the Council could recover and attempt a larger strike, and they prepared accordingly. Fleets were positioned not just for defense, but for coordination across sectors. Communication networks were layered and redundant. Colonies became interconnected hubs of monitoring and protection. The human species had transformed itself into a network of intelligence, strategy, and readiness, capable of reacting to threats across vast distances. Humanity's efforts extended beyond defense. The species also sought to assert moral authority. Evidence of the Council's abuses, once hidden, was now public, revealing decades of manipulation, oppression, and interference. These revelations caused shockwaves across the galaxy. Many species that had once followed the Council unquestioningly began to reconsider their positions. Humanity was using more than technology. They were using truth, intelligence, and moral clarity as a shield and as a tool for influence. Across Earth, ordinary people felt empowered. The raid on the distant colony had been an attack, but it had also been the catalyst for a transformation. Humans were no longer passive, no longer constrained by fear or intimidation. Every person contributed, every action mattered, and every voice was heard. The species had united around a common goal: to protect itself, its colonies, and its place in the galaxy. This unity became the true power behind every fleet, every strategy, and every technological advancement. By the end of this period, humanity had achieved more than defense. They had asserted themselves as a species to be reckoned with, capable of intelligence, coordination, and moral authority on a galactic scale. The Council, once untouchable, had been challenged and exposed. Neutral species were watching closely. Humanity had not just responded, they had changed the narrative, showing that patience, preparation, and unity could overcome intimidation and aggression. The first phase of humanity's counteraction had succeeded beyond expectations. Fleets were prepared, colonies were secured, communication networks were robust, and the truth of the Council's abuses was clear across the galaxy. Humans had proven they could act decisively, protect lives, and command respect. Every citizen, from engineers to volunteers, understood that this was only the beginning, and that the unity forged through anger, preparation, and resolve would continue to define the species. The galaxy was watching. After months of careful preparation, precise strikes, and strategic counteractions, humanity had demonstrated that it was no longer a species to be underestimated. For centuries, the Council had ruled with unquestioned authority, confident that their power and control were absolute, but their assumptions had been shattered. The raid on the distant colony had been the spark, and humans had ignited a movement that stretched across every planet, every colony, and every star system they had touched. On Earth, there was no room for complacency. Every scientist, soldier, engineer, and volunteer understood that the final phase of their response would require focus, unity, and unwavering determination. Fleets were deployed to key positions. Colonies were reinforced with shields and defensive. Technology and communication networks were stronger than ever. Humans had turned their entire species into a coordinated force capable of reacting instantly across light years. The preparation had been meticulous, the planning precise, and the resolve absolute. The Council, meanwhile, struggled to regroup. Their fleets had been disabled, their communications compromised, and their authority questioned across the galaxy. Observers from neutral systems began to align themselves with humanity, or, at the very least, reconsider their loyalty to the Council. Diplomats were sent to try and negotiate, but they were met with calm, measured responses from Earth's leaders. Humanity was no longer interested in polite discussions or empty promises. They had acted, and now they would finalize their position. The next engagement was inevitable. The Council sent a large fleet, far greater than the first, intending to overwhelm human defenses with sheer numbers. But humans had anticipated this. Fleets were positioned in patterns designed to maximize defense and minimize risk. Colonies were shielded, satellites enhanced, and every strategy that had been developed through months of preparation was ready to be deployed. Humans had learned that strength alone was not enough. Intelligence, coordination, and unity were the true weapons. When the Council fleet arrived, expecting chaos and fear, they found something entirely different. Human ships moved with precision, coordinating their actions across vast distances. The Council had assumed humans would panic or retreat, but instead, they executed maneuvers that trapped portions of the fleet while protecting colonies and civilian ships. The engagement was not about destruction. It was about demonstrating capability, control, and unity. Humans disabled Council ships, redirected attacks, and neutralized threats without unnecessary loss of life. From command centers on Earth, leaders observed with quiet pride. Every calculation had been correct. every plan executed flawlessly. The human species, once underestimated, was now demonstrating its full potential. This was not recklessness or chaos. It was strategic brilliance born from preparation, coordination, and decades of ingenuity. Ordinary citizens watched in awe, realizing that they were participants in a moment that would be remembered for generations. Back on Earth, communities continued to support the effort. Volunteers monitored communications, analyzed data, and coordinated resources. Scientists and engineers shared real-time updates, improving technologies on the fly. Every person understood that their contribution mattered. Humanity had transformed from a planet-bound species into a coordinated force capable of influencing outcomes across the galaxy. The attack on the colony had been tragic, but it had also been the catalyst for this extraordinary evolution. The Council's confusion turned into desperation. They could not comprehend how humans had achieved such precision and unity. Every tactic they attempted was countered. Every move was anticipated. Their fleets, once symbols of authority and power, were now evidence of their miscalculation. Observers from neutral systems took note. The Council was no longer untouchable. Humans had proven that they could act decisively, intelligently, and without fear. Humanity's response was not driven by vengeance. They had the capability to destroy the Council fleet entirely, but restraint was a conscious choice. The objective was to protect lives, assert authority, and demonstrate strength without unnecessary destruction. The Council's fleets were disabled, colonies were secure, and communication networks were intact. The message was clear. Humanity was capable, determined, and united, and they would no longer tolerate oppression. Evidence of the Council's misdeeds was broadcast across systems, highlighting decades of interference, oppression, and arbitrary control. Other species, once loyal or indifferent to the Council, began to reconsider their positions. Diplomats and leaders across the galaxy reached out to Earth, seeking guidance, alliance, and clarification. Humanity was no longer just a species to be controlled. They were leaders, exemplifying strategy, intelligence, and moral clarity in human fleets. Pilots and engineers worked seamlessly, demonstrating that preparation and coordination were more powerful than raw strength. Every movement was calculated, every decision deliberate. Humans had learned that true power lay in unity, intelligence, and the ability to adapt. The engagement became a demonstration of what the species could achieve when fear was replaced with strategy and determination. Colonies, once vulnerable, were now fully integrated into a global defense network. Each outpost could communicate instantly, coordinate responses, and protect its population. Scientists worked alongside soldiers, engineers alongside strategists, and volunteers alongside leaders. Humanity had created a system where every individual's contribution mattered, and that collective effort was unstoppable. The Council, unable to regain control, finally agreed to negotiations. But these discussions were different from the past. Humanity approached the table not as supplicants, but as equals, with evidence, preparation, and the credibility of demonstrated capability. The Council could no longer rely on intimidation. They had to respect the species they had long underestimated. The negotiations resulted in significant changes across the galaxy. Human colonies were granted autonomy, interstellar trade routes were secured, and future interactions with the Council were to be based on equality and mutual respect. The galaxy had witnessed a transformation. Humans had moved from a species to be controlled into one that could assert influence, protect itself, and demand justice. On Earth, the population celebrated quietly, understanding that victory was not about destruction, but about recognition and protection. Citizens had contributed to a historic moment, proving that unity, intelligence, and perseverance could achieve what was once thought impossible. Humanity had not only defended itself, but had reshaped its place in the galaxy, earning respect and influence it had never held before. The final lesson was clear. Patience had limits, intelligence was a weapon, and unity was unstoppable. Humans had endured centuries of condescension, threats, and oppression. They had been pushed to their limits, but they had responded not with blind rage, but with strategy, coordination, and moral clarity. The raid on the distant colony had been the spark, and humanity had risen to demonstrate its full potential. Across the galaxy, humans were no longer underestimated. Neutral species recognized their capability, allies saw their determination, and the Council learned the lesson that would not be forgotten. Humanity had snapped, yes, but in that snapping was precision, intelligence, and strength. The species had transformed, asserting its place among the stars and ensuring that no colony, no citizen, and no settlement would ever face such oppression. Again, by the end of this chapter, humanity had achieved more than survival. They had demonstrated leadership, intelligence, and moral authority. Fleets were prepared, colonies secure, and communication networks robust. The galaxy had been shown that humans were capable of acting decisively, protecting themselves and asserting their rights. Ordinary citizens understood that their collective effort had shaped history, proving that unity, determination, and strategy could overcome even the most formidable power. And so, as the stars shone above Earth and its colonies, humanity settled into a new era. The Council had been forced to acknowledge a species it had long underestimated. The raid on the distant colony had ignited a chain of events that transformed humans from a species to be controlled into a force to be respected. Humanity had snapped, but in that snapping was focus, clarity, and an unshakable resolve. The galaxy had witnessed the awakening of a species that could protect itself, lead with intelligence, and demand recognition. Humans had acted decisively, strategically, and morally. They had defended their colonies, neutralized threats, and reshaped the political landscape of interstellar space. The Council had learned that intimidation would no longer work, and humanity had proven that preparation, unity, and perseverance could achieve the impossible. Humanity had reached a turning point. No longer passive, no longer underestimated, the species had demonstrated its full potential. Every citizen, from volunteers to scientists, from soldiers to engineers, had contributed to this historic moment. The raid on the colony had been a tragedy, but it had also been the catalyst for transformation. Humanity had snapped, and in doing so, had forever changed the galaxy.